don't think it's on.
Hello.
Oh, now it's on. Now it's on.
How's that?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Okay, Assalamu alaikum everyone. We're about to start. Are we okay to recording आप कर रहे हैं?
आपकी मर्जी
क्या हुआ?
वो कह रही है मूव कर दे
हाँ,
ऐसा आपकी मर्जी है
करनी है? वो आ नहीं रहे. It's okay. I mean, well, he's not able to make. Nice,
वो
can't
नहीं
make
आ
it.
रहे वो नहीं आ सकेंगे हाँ
We can start.
क्या कह रहे अच्छा so who's funding this who's the okay okay अच्छा
Okay, I think we'll get started now. So, Assalamu alaikum everyone. Thank you so much for coming here. I know there are lots of other interesting panels happening right now, so we're really pleased that some of you decided to come here. My name is Fizzah Sajjad. I'm an urban planner and a researcher, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. Um, and you know, the topic today is the question of urban land, and this is a really big topic, but it's one that requires urgent attention because the way that we're utilizing land, and I just have to state straightforward right at the start, is completely unsustainable and will be disastrous for us going into the future. So land, as we all know, is a very scarce resource, and the decisions that we make about how we use it today are irreversible, meaning that we have to deliberate on this very deeply and make choices that are equitable and sustainable in the long run. And what's interesting is that this is recognized now by a wide range of actors, including those that are in the state and the private sector, but there's actually very little change in terms of practice and in terms of the developments that we see around us. And you know, our cities, as we know them, are continuing to expand rapidly, particularly through the conversion of land on the peripheries of our cities, from agricultural to residential use. And the space for affordable housing is continuing to shrink. And this isn't just this limited to big cities like Karachi, Islamabad, or Lahore, but it's also happening in secondary cities. So today what we're going to do is we're going to spend a little bit of time trying to think about why this is so, what's driving this form of growth, what are the politics here, what are the differences and similarities with countries outside of Pakistan, and how do we think about more equitable futures more concretely. And I'm really, really pleased to have with us two esteemed panelists who will help us understand this a little bit better. Unfortunately, Fahad Malik, who was supposed to be here, wasn't able to make it, but I think we have very little time, so we'll be able to have a deeper discussion. So just to introduce our panelists, we have with us first Dr. Aisha Ahmad. Aisha Ahmad is an assistant professor at the Sheikh Ahmed Hassan School of Law at LUMS. Her research looks at land and urban governance in Lahore, and she is interested in interdisciplinary approaches to law, law and development, and the political economy of law. Aisha holds a PhD from the Department of International Development at the University of Oxford. Before this, she has an MPhil in Development Studies from the University of Oxford, as well as an LLM from Harvard and a BA from LUMS. So thanks, Aisha, for being here. We also have with us Dr. Sadaf Sultan. Sadaf Sultan is a research fellow in the cities clusters at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex. She's previously trained and practiced as an architect in Karachi, and she's completed a PhD in urban morphology and contested urbanisms from UCL's Bartlett School of Architecture. And the mainstreams within her work have been the socio-spatial investigation of the migrant experience and its manifestations on the impact of the urban environment, the implications of rapid urbanization on the spatial form and processes of growth and development of developing cities, particularly informal urban settlements. Sadaf has worked extensively on projects not just in Pakistan, but also in East Africa, Turkey, and Europe. So thank you both so much for being here today, and I'm really looking forward to learning from your work. And before we start, I just wanted to very quickly share some of the logistics around this panel. So, we हमारे पास 50 minutes हैं discussion के लिए. इसमें we'll spend about 40 minutes. So we're, until 5:50, we'll discuss this amongst ourselves, and then we'll open up for 10 minutes for question and answers, and then you're welcome to continue the discussion outside as well with everyone. So let's begin. And Aisha, thanks again for joining, and I wanted to start with you. So you worked extensively on the question of urban land. So based on your work, why is there this frenzy for land in both major and secondary cities in Pakistan? And what's driving this kind of rapid land conversion, particularly over the past 20 years or so?
Thank you, Fizzah, for that question. Can everybody hear me? It's audible enough? Okay, great. Yes, frenzy is a really good way to put it. Why is there a frenzy? Certainly it is a frenzy. I mean, the way I always like to explain to people who are not familiar with Pakistan, कि Pakistan में कितनी obsession है with land, is that other cricket teams are sponsored by multinational corporations, but Pakistan's cricket team is sponsored by Parkview housing scheme, which is quite funny and quite strange and should not be normalized. And it's, I guess, no surprise that both the scheme and the team are drowning these days. But in any case, frenzy is certainly the right way to put it. And what we've seen in the last, particularly since the year kind of 2000, 2001, is Pakistan slowly but surely becoming what everybody is now referring to it as Plotistan, right? This obsession with plots and files and speculative trade and speculative urbanism in general. But jo Fizzah ka sawal hai wo ye hai ki kyun, why are we finding ourselves in Plotistan today? What is the reason for this? And I think that there's no one answer. I think the best way to answer it is to multiple levels, multiple dimensions of analysis, starting from the global and all the way kind of rooting it back to the local. So I don't think a local economy एक isolation में function करती है. Obviously, जो global context है, that has impacted Pakistan's real estate sector very, very significantly. First of all, ये kind of जो big picture जवाब है, it's basically कि we've seen since the 70s a shift away from developmentalism, from kind of organizing economies in a rational state-led way towards marketization, towards privatization, towards liberalization. And that doesn't just manifest in economic governance, it also manifests in urban governance, whereby local governments and administrative authorities, उनका जो number one pursuit है वो है कि शहर को किसी तरह मतलब कि profitable करें, right? And so that profit market logic has become really dominant in cities around the world, and that same logic of governance kind of finds its way through to Pakistan as well. So we're not really exceptional in that case, which I'm sure Sadaf will say a lot about in a few minutes. But Pakistan में सबसे जो interesting चीज़ है वो ये है कि पाकिस्तान में जो I think Plotistan वाली कहानी है वो 2000 से ही शुरू होती है. And what else is a thing that happened in the early 2000s? 9/11, and people will be like, why is she talking about 9/11? But what was interesting was that a lot of Pakistani sort of diasporic Pakistani communities whose bank accounts started facing more scrutiny after 9/11 found Pakistan to be a very interesting place to take their money and invest. And most of that investment went into property. And since then, we've seen a big boom in property in not just Lahore, but in most cities in Pakistan. In fact, in the 2000s, when that much money came back into Pakistan, Musharraf was then heading our state. And in all of the local administrative authorities, local government ki ho gayi, even provincial government ki, sare matlab ke pure Pakistan ke shehron mein, they were full of people from the building and construction communities. So, it just goes to show how much building, construction, property, commercialization of land became an organizing logic in Pakistan during that time. So ये तो global कहानी है. जो local कहानी है वो भी है. जब ये globally सारा कुछ हो रहा है तो आपकी local opportunities भी बढ़ जाती हैं for profitable investment, और हमने यही देखा है पाकिस्तान में. Now, I think in order to understand why so many people are obsessed with housing schemes and somehow converting land into these kinds of profitable ventures, it's really important to get a sense of just how profitable they are, because I know we have an idea of it, but it's really important to make it, I think, very graphic for people. So my own housing scheme that I investigated for my PhD was LDA City, which is off Firozpur Road here in Lahore. And when I was kind of doing research for it starting in 2016 and then all the way up to 2020, the rates of compensation that people were getting for their land was about 25 lakhs to 1 crore per acre, okay? 1 acre of land has about 8 canals in it, okay? So 8 canal ki zameen, somebody was getting, for 8 of their canals of land, they were getting 25 lakhs or 40 lakhs or 50 lakh rupees. Now that same 1 canal of land, as per zameen.com today, is for 1.2 crore. So it is just unimaginable levels of kind of topping up on the profits. And so anyone who's anyone wants to be involved in that project. So wo to obvious ek wajah hai why we've seen so much frenetic, crazy, sort of rapid urbanization. And then it's not just with housing schemes. We're generally talking about urban land. Commercialization is another big part of it. कि बस सब चाहते हैं कि लाहौर में हम किसी तरह इस इलाके को भी commercialize कर दें, उस इलाके को भी commercialize कर दें, क्योंकि हमें उसकी fee मिलेगी, हमें पैसे मिलते जाएंगे. So again, profiteering, that speculative sort of flavor that takes on all of governance in the world also then very much infiltrates in Pakistan. फिर लैंड माफिया का भी सवाल obviously हम इग्नोर नहीं कर सकते जो local level पे operate करती है. वो लैंड माफिया सिर्फ, when we think of land mafia we think of like, you know, sort of dons and secret places, but actually they're probably suited booted people who are also bureaucrats. So the land mafia in Pakistan, as per my own sort of empirical investigation, consists of, yes, the dons that are sitting in shadowy places making fake certificates and documents, but they also consist of people who are local government में involved, जो हमारी development authorities में involved हैं. वो उन सब की collusion के through you have activities that make it easy to pursue profit through urban land. And that is another reason why we're seeing the situation that we're seeing. और आखिरी जो I think level of analysis मैं करूँगी, I'm sorry if I'm taking too long, is the administrative, bureaucratic and legal level, the local kind of, the more nuts and bolts of governance level. इसमें भी बड़े मज़े से मुराद tragic and depressing किस्म की examples or illustrations हैं. So for instance, in terms of administration, अगर आप land use rules को देखें, मैं वकील हूँ और मेरा जो PhD भी था, it was very much a social legal investigation. So I was very interested in the law of urban land, the laws around urban land. And it's really, really interesting to see that हमारे जो LDA land use rules हैं लाहौर के लिए, they kind of govern के ज़मीन, what can this land be used for? Can it be used for commercial purposes, residential purposes, industrial purposes? That is what land use rules are. Our land use rules have changed starting from the 2006 land use rules, 2006 में, 2009, 2014, 2019, and 2020, okay? Just to give you an idea of how unstable this is, the average planning law in sub-Saharan Africa has a lifespan of 14 years. And in 14 years, our land use laws changed 5 times, okay? Just to show you how, so it's not just frenzied and frenetic in terms of land, it's also frenzied and frenetic in terms of the law around land, which creates this environment of obfuscation, kind of a fuzziness that people who have access to networks and money and personnel can really take advantage of to continue to pursue land development that they kind of want to see. And then there's the problem of political consensus. That's another really, really important part. Yahan, obviously, hum kafi polarized times mein we live, right? And so everybody is like, oh, Ruda, Imran Khan pagal hai, usne kyun Ruda kiya? I don't know if I can say this, I have to be careful. But you know, Imran Khan is responsible for Ruda, oh, Nawaz Sharif is responsible for this, that, and the other housing scheme. But ultimately, we see the same governing logic that is operating regardless of who's in power when it comes to the question of urban land. So when Imran Khan was in power, he himself said कि जो हमने green cover delegate किया हुआ ज़मीन के ये यहाँ कोई housing scheme नहीं बन सकती, ये green land है, यहाँ environmentally हमारे शहरों के लिए बहुत ज़रूरी है कि ये green ही रहे. He was very big on that and talked about it a lot during his election campaign. But then when he came into power, passed a law through ordinance that basically in Punjab that regularized illegal housing schemes. कि अगर आपने illegal housing scheme बनाई है, आप फिक्र ना करें, जो total land का value है 2% आप हमें दे दो, हम legal कर देंगे आपकी ज़मीन को. But if you think that this is Imran Khan being evil, that's not the case, because we've just seen Maryam Nawaz in June of this year say that she's going to regularize 5,000 illegal housing schemes in Punjab. So it's again the same activities, the same governing logic. Ruda, for instance, is something Imran Khan is given a lot of blame for, but if you look at the plans for Ruda, they date all the way back to the early 2000s and the mid-2000s when Nawaz Sharif's government was in power. So again, it's a political consensus around use of land that everyone agrees should be more speculative than productive, should be more profitable than perhaps socially useful. And that's why we find ourselves in the position that we're in. And I guess we can leave the legal analysis to a little bit later, but that's my big kind of broad answer for why we find ourselves in the position that we're in.
Thank you so much, Aisha. That's really helpful, I think. And I think based on my work also, what I've seen is in the early 2000s, there's all this money coming into real estate and into land, and there's a frenzy for land. And a lot of it has to do, of course, with the larger global structural conditions, but also there's a new development that takes place at that time, which is that we've invented this new instrument which we know as the file, right? So before that, we didn't necessarily have, land was traded off the books and informally, etc. But it's only in the early 2000s that the file officially comes into being, and both DHA and Beria take credit for coming up with this file. But the thing is that land on its own, it's not, it's not an asset that you can trade easily. But the file, because it's removed from land, because it's a promise of land that is being traded in the market, allows speculative development to also happen. So in terms of, finding a way to finance that activity also, that's something that changes in the early 2000s, and I find really fascinating because that's allowed the market to take off at that moment as well. But just coming to you, Sadaf, and I'm going to come back to Aisha just on a couple of questions also. But you worked in both Karachi and elsewhere as well. And of course, as Aisha was also saying, these problems are not unique to Pakistan, right? We see the issue of sprawl, we see urban expansion, looking at speculative development all over the world. But is there anything that's very peculiar to Lahore based on my understanding? I haven't come across a lot of other cities in the world where speculative exchange happens on plots of land. A lot of people, it's usually houses that, all of this development happens on. Very few places. I don't know. I would love to hear from you and just to think about the similarities and differences between our context and elsewhere.
So can you hear me? A little bit lower. Can you hear me? Okay. So I think whilst Aisha has spoken about kind of housing schemes, I think the other side of this is the informal angle of this, which is, and both these things go hand in hand. As far as speculation goes, my work doesn't necessarily look at that. Can you hear me? Should I move forward? Yeah. Okay. My work doesn't essentially look at that, but I think what it does look at is this play between the formal and the informal. So what are your formal housing or planned areas, and the informal, which are kind of growing alongside them or may precede them, and that all. So what you're ending up with, and we've seen this both so I've worked in Khartoum in Sudan, and then also a similar project we did in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. And I think very similar things are happening, for example, in Karachi, where you see inner city densification and you have urban sprawl at the same time, where the peripheries are low density, and this kind of parallel between new towns, so housing schemes, but also informal settlements that are kind of developing alongside them, kind of feeding off of the services that are being provided or are expected to come out to these housing schemes. These informal settlements may be people who have been relocated from inner city evictions, but they may simultaneously be people who are coming in from the rural areas or relocating to cities, and that's where they find affordable housing. It's essentially about affordable housing. And even people who are moving out to housing schemes at the periphery, it is about trade-offs. I can afford this piece of land, and I can afford to build here. I have a car, so I can commute into the city. But I can't afford a home in the inner city or the city center. And similarly, I think people who are living in informal settlements, they are also making these calculations. How much am I spending to commute back into the city, and what am I getting out of being out in the peripheries in an informal setting? So I think that is what we're seeing in our work, this kind of parallel informal versus formal kind of development. Obviously, there's also a difference in the kind of densities you're looking at. So the informal is highly dense versus the planned, which is low density sprawl. And I think what is critical is also understanding how services and this kind of expansion of settlement don't necessarily run at the same speed. So expansion is happening in terms of informal or formal settlement, but services are at a lag, so they catch up. And there is this expectation that when they catch up, then we can also kind of link up to those systems. Does that make sense? So I think this is the kind of thing we are seeing. In Sudan, what we were seeing was a lot of this was being done from the state. So people who were living in inner city informal settlements were being, depending on how long you had been in a location, you were given either preference in terms of staying on there. If you had been there longer, then those people who they felt kind of exceeded the capacity of the area were given sites and services plots at the periphery. But the promise of services, they don't show up. So they are living in kind of bare minimum settings, in kachi kind of huts with a water tank. The only thing that will be pakka is the local mosque and nothing else. And we interviewed one person and they said, this is, when asked, why didn't you just go back to where you were originally? They're like, this way in that situation, because it's so precarious to live on in those informal settlements in the inner city, they're like, in that context, it feels like you die 100 times a day. In this way, we know that we're going to get no support, so it's one death and we're done with it. So I think this is what is interesting in terms of kind of land and urban expansion, this kind of high density, low density play, formal versus informal service provision, who does and does not get. This is what we're seeing in the work that we're doing.
Thanks, Sadaf. And I think that also reminds me a lot of the work of Dr. Gautam Ban in India, where he talks about, this idea of housing. For housing to be successful, he says housing has to be affordable, it has to be adequate, and it has to be viable. So it has to be affordable in terms of your ability to pay for it, but it has to be adequate in terms of access to services, and viable in terms of proximity to jobs, etc. So this is also why you have so many instances of new developments being made into peripheries failing, because they haven't thought about all these things which all have to come together, but there's always some trade-off or the other that happens. Which also, I think will come back, actually helps us come back to the question of housing, because a lot of the developments, speculative or otherwise, all of these housing schemes that are made on the peripheries of our cities are made in the name of addressing housing shortages, right? So we're always told that, हमारी housing की need इतनी ज़्यादा है, shortage है, 10 लाख की shortage है, इसलिए हम ये स्कीमें बना रहे हैं in the peripheries. And if you look, just a really quick glance through Google Maps, a lot of these schemes are still empty, right? A lot of these plots are vacant, people are not living on them. And so one wonders कि किसकी housing की need पूरी करें, और उसके साथ साथ आप देखते हैं कि like Sadaf is saying, in inner cities areas, you have densification happening, right? Because people actually can't find housing that is affordable and viable, and so they're building up. And we talk about informal settlements, but हमारे यहाँ सबसे ज़्यादा जो supply affordable housing की, at least Lahore के context में, it's in urban villages. So what were former village settlements that have been surrounded by these housing schemes and have become part of the city. So all of this has been being done in the name of housing, but it doesn't seem to be addressing the housing problem. And so, Aisha, I was wondering if you had more to say about that. And or am I just overseeing something? Is this a good way to go about solving the problem?
What do you think I'm going to say, Fizzah? No, it's
Trick
not a good way.
question.
If it were a good way, I think I agree with everything you've said, and you've put it so succinctly. No, it's not a good way, only because, forget everything else, but the numbers don't tell us that it's, like you said, the housing crisis, the sort of shortfall in housing units increases year by year, regardless of the fact that also housing schemes are mushrooming year by year. So clearly there is a mismatch between what the purpose that is being stated for which these schemes are being built and the actual purposes that are being served. Vacancy is a great lens through which to understand that, like Fizzah just said. According to a 2020 study said that about 40 to 45% of all formal developed plots in I think it's Lahore. I don't know if it's nationally or if it's in Punjab. I'll find out, but just to give you an idea, 40 to 45% of those plots
I think 60% across Punjab.
60% across Punjab. 60% of all formally developed plots are vacant. So just imagine the number of housing schemes that are built, and then imagine how many plots are developed, and then 6 out of 10 of them are still, they're empty. And this is despite the fact that we have a national housing shortage of about 10 million units right now. So clearly, I don't think that this is the solution, and And it's not just about vacancy and lack of housing units, it's also about the nature of the housing units that are available and the extent to which those are accessible. Because, I mean, there's one 2014 statistic that all of us like to quote in our research and in our public sort of talks like this one. But it's quite a staggering illustration of just how elitist and exclusionary housing development in Pakistan is. So according to a 2014 study, less than 1% of available housing was affordable for the poorest 68% in Pakistan. So 70% of your population is fighting over less than 1% of available housing stock. I don't know how else to maybe illustrate that, but I think that's graphic enough. So it's not just a lack of housing, it's also the nature of housing that is being developed that is ultimately hugely inaccessible to a vast majority of people. And like I said, we have way too many housing schemes. They're not serving purposes. There's about 370 housing schemes in Lahore alone, I think, as per LDA 2023. And 200 of them are illegal, but you know, Mariam Nawaz is going to take care of that soon. And once it is regularized, then the problem is that that's not going to be, it is being quoted as a solution for housing crisis. That's the important thing to understand. So if you open up your newspapers and you read Mariam Nawaz saying that hum regularize isliye kar rahe hain kyunki hum logon ko housing dena cha rahe hain, don't believe that, because unfortunately when you regularize these schemes, they still remain unaffordable and they still remain basically fodder for speculative investment.
I think one other interesting point is also that a lot of these schemes that are completely empty on the peripheries are actually fully sold out. So when you go to these, you know, to the offices and you ask to buy a plot, for instance, they're already 100% sold. So why is nobody living there? And that's also because we have a system in place in which developers have basically figured out a mechanism through which they actually sell promises of plots of land to investors first. And then those files eventually come down to end users. So the people actually making the most money are the ones who are buying in the beginning. And you know, middle class folks then later come in expecting to make money off of these investments. But a lot of the times the cost actually has to be borne by these same people, because by the time it reaches them, you know, it's hawa mein unhone prices badhai hui hoti hain. So that's another kind of outcome of the way that this development has happened. But you know, aside from this point around housing, what are some of the other costs and challenges that you think we have to face because of this issue of sprawl?
I think, I referred to it earlier, I think it's infrastructure, so services and service provision. Whether you are commercializing previously residential areas, which has happened in Karachi, for example, Shara Faisal was a residential street, and then 2010 they commercialized the whole strip. So it went from being 1:1 to 1:9 or 9.5, right? That means that now your infrastructure, whether it's parking or water or electricity, the demand on that suddenly shoots up. But that infrastructure is not designed for that purpose, right? So that's one thing. When you move out to the peripheries, it's the lack of infrastructure. What you will see, or the patterns of kind of settlement that you will see, is informal settlements will grow along main thoroughfares because people need to catch a bus to come into work. And then formal kind of settlements will happen in the in-between, but they will have the services. So that is something I think needs to be considered. And going back to a point that Aisha made earlier regarding kind of who the housing that is being made is affordable for. If you look at numbers, for example, in Dar es Salaam or in Karachi, you're looking at upwards of 50% of the population living on 20% of the land, and that 20% of the land is informal. So you know that idea of who are you building for, and you know, is it truly affordable, is something to kind of consider.
Yeah, honestly, I wish I had a map to show, but if you map out informal settlements in Lahore, and you map out urban villages in Lahore and some of its older dense settlements, it's actually a very small percentage of the total land area of the city, and the majority of your city's population actually resides there, where public services, public infrastructure has rapidly deteriorated over the past few decades. And in contrast, you see in places, you know, and this is just an estimate, but DHA Lahore now has 13 phases. And they very proudly say on their website that we now cover a whopping quarter of Lahore's land area. So that means, let's say we take their word for it, even if that might not be an accurate statistics. 25% of land area is now solely DHA. But that land is only accessible to less than 5% of the population, and I'm being generous. It's not even accessible to 5%, right? So who are we using this land for? That's exactly like a question that we need to be asking. But Aisha, I was wondering if you wanted to add to any of other challenges that we see as an outcome of this form of growth as well.
I mean, one thing I would like to comment on a little bit more is the role of the law, which I haven't done so far. And then I have a question, actually, if you don't mind, to ask Sadaf. But I guess briefly, one often likes to think that chalo aur kuch nahi to our legal entities will be able to be a source of redressal and reprieve from this. But unfortunately, they've played a very constitutive role in terms of actually establishing the kind of housing landscape that we have today. So one really weird thing, and I wonder if this happens in other parts as well, actually, now that I think about it, is that we use eminent domain powers and land acquisition powers in Pakistan for the developing of private housing schemes. Eminent domain is literally just like if you want to build a bridge or if you want to build a road that is supposed to serve the public, then you can, for a public purpose, kind of coercively take somebody's private land and give them compensation for it. But in Pakistan, we use the same Land Acquisition Act for housing, or we were. I think we're still trying to figure it out. But we definitely use it for the development of private housing. So even entities like Beria and DHA benefit from this in different ways. But yes, the Land Acquisition Act, and if you read Supreme Court jurisprudence in Pakistan, they literally say, okay, even if one person can get a house, then it's a public purpose, okay, which is obviously interesting. And then actually what's really interesting based on everything we've just discussed is that they say कि ये plots तो market में available है ना, कोई भी ले सकता है, तो public के लिए हैं, so therefore it's a public purpose. So that's kind of the role that our legal entities have also been playing in terms of constituting this crisis. Generally, even again, if you look at sort of the financial speculative aspect of this, in court hearings, when you go and observe them, for instance, कभी कोई dispossession का case हो या कोई इस तरह का case हो, तो जो affectees होते हैं in cases में, it's not the villagers who are living there often. The affectees are the early file holders. कि जो बेचारों ने invest किया था 5-10 साल पहले, उनका क्या बनेगा? Because Saqib Nisar used to say that widows and other sort of marginalized entities were suffering because they had invested in housing schemes, and they were affectees. And certainly they are affectees, but then the people who are actually living on those lands, I remember the villages that I was looking at, they were not allowed entry into the Supreme Court. They were outside and they were protesting, but they were the most affected, in the Supreme Court in its physical space and in its discursive space was not treating them as actual affectees of the processes that were happening. So yeah, I think one cannot ignore the role of law also in constituting this crisis. But if you don't mind, I do have a question, which is a bit of an annoying question. It's kind of a pet peeve of mine. But I think your work is so fascinating, and I'm just curious, when you say informal, what do you mean? Because when I study the formal, I study law, I study legal entities, and all of those dynamics of informality, they infiltrate formal lawmaking as well. So is that division, and it's for you too, Fizzah, is it helpful for us? I'm sure it is. Why do you think it is? And also, what separates the two?
So I should probably refer to what we would see as slums or kachi abadis or favelas as unplanned, right? Rather than informal, because informal, you can be a planned settlement but be informal because there is no kind of legal reason why you should be there, right? The reason why perhaps I choose not to is because slums come with their own kind of linguistic baggage, right? In a lot of discourse, there's this kind of Victorian weight attached to it, like they are unhygienic, they are vectors of disease, so on and so forth, right? So one should probably refer to them as unplanned versus planned, as opposed to formal versus informal. There is the legal element of informal settlements, and in the context of unplanned, it is a lot of the time, or a slum, it is a lot of the time about the materiality of it and what they don't necessarily have. So what they lack in terms of sanitation, what they lack in terms of water, what they lack in terms of materiality. So how permanent is the structure itself? So in terms of definition, that is where it sits. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay.
I like that. I like the unplanned plan very much. I think that solves a lot of problems.
Yeah, and I think when we talk about informal, and I guess that's why your pet peeve also comes in, or assuming, is, Bahria town is just as informal as a Kachi Abadi, right? Because it hasn't been built with formal laws either. But informality, in that sense, if it hasn't been planned or if it hasn't been given legal sanction, that's the dominant way of being in our cities, right? There's no, whether it's in Kachi Abadis or housing schemes that are illegal per se. But yeah, we will talk about this more. But I wanted to actually very quickly, Aisha, just come back to this question about dispossession. And you mentioned that in courts you have people who have been dispossessed from their land, not even allowed inside. And you work closely with people who whose land has been acquired for housing schemes. So how has that taken place, and who are the winners and losers in this process? Because not everyone is affected in the same way also, right? We're also told some people are very willing to sell their land.
Yeah.
So want you to say more on that.
I think that's a really important thing to address, because I've seen a lot of middle class backlash, but also empirically rooted truth in the assertion that ये लोग तो चाहते हैं कि एलडीए यहाँ आए और डीएचए यहाँ आए और बैरिया यहाँ आए और लेक सिटी यहाँ आए ताकि उनको पैसे मिलें. They will never see money like that in their lives, and I don't think that's totally untrue. I do think that there are people who benefit. Of course, there are, and I'm sure Sadaf could speak to this way more adeptly than me. But just in terms of like, what is your? Are you a large landowner? Are you a small landowner? Are you landless but historically have been living in a village? I think those kind of markers determine obviously the kind of compensation you can expect to get. So there is variation amongst the material interests of those being quote unquote dispossessed, and that impacts their kind of their interest in the scheme being taken away or not. There's also the question of like, how close are you to main thoroughfares? How close are you to infrastructure in the planned scheme? Usse bhi aapko zyada compensation milegi. But like you said, the people who benefit from this most are early investors who already know कि यहाँ एक सड़क आएगी और यहाँ एक water tank ही आएगी और मैं यहाँ की ज़मीन ले लेता हूँ. So it's really, I'm not sure if that's actually something that affects dispossession discourse that much. And then there's also the question of actually जो मतलब कि गांव के लोग होते हैं जो middlemen बन जाते हैं, जो investors के लिए जाके अपने बहन भाइयों को, cousins को, uncles को, whoever, they try to convince them कि चलो ज़मीन बेच दो, इससे ज़्यादा पैसे नहीं मिलेंगे, या if you delay it तो फिर हुकूमत आके आपको और भी कम पैसे देगी, that kind of thing. So they use that kind of discourse of duress, I guess, to kind of force people into selling their land, and they obviously benefit from this monetarily as well. But from what I've seen, many of my interlocutors in my villages were actually the larger landowners in the area. And they were dead set against selling their land, because the problem was that even if they managed to get a great amount of money, there's going to be, maybe they'll buy 1 canal of land or maybe 2 canals of land, or maybe they're given in exchange a canal or plot in the housing scheme. But a lot of the people I spoke to had aspirations of building a house for each one of their sons on their acres of land. And so that kind of goes out the window. So there's that cultural sort of, I think, affinity to the land as well that cannot be dismissed. Which is an important part of why people continue to resist, despite the fact that they might be getting a big payout at the end of the day. And like I always say, I think there's a tendency to problematize dispossession out of existence these days. कि ये तो इतने cunning or sly लोग हैं, ये तो, I don't know. I know it's empirically there, but based on what I've seen, I think there's been a great deal of resistance to land dispossession in the vicinity I've been, and that resistance has been led by often the most powerful, kind of socially more important people in that village as well as the landless, as well as the small landowners. So I guess that's my very kind of complex and annoying answer about who wins and who loses. But also who wins are the developers. I think that's another thing. We live in a city, Lahore, जिसमें हमारा जो LDA है, वो developer भी है, और वो regulator भी है. So, make sense of that. And based on the interviews I've had with people at the LDA, they've literally said things like, जब भी हमें पैसों का मसला होता है या revenue generation का मसला होता है, authority में तो हम एक housing scheme announce कर देते हैं. So of course the institutional sort of interest in these housing schemes, a big winner in this are the regulators / developers. So that's an entity one cannot ignore.
No, I don't think I have anything to add to that.
Yeah, absolutely. The development authorities were so the state is very much complicit in the way that this happens. I mean, we have half of a quarter of the city that isn't answerable to anyone also, right? And that's the same kind of strategy that they use.
Actually, but if you add cantonment areas and stuff, it goes up to like 40% of the city.
Probably more, yeah. And then the reasons for expanding are one, because we have to offer land as a reward for officer service, right? So that's the reason for using land which has nothing to do with housing, right? It's just a speculative asset, not one, not two, sometimes three plots of land that are given. And you're absolutely right, the developers are the ones who are benefiting from this, and the kinds of divisions that you see, like that we, I guess, have observed in the field also are an outcome of the strategies that developers use, right? So developers use market-based strategies to try to sow disaccord within people also. So I had someone tell me, they were like, people have a very strong relationship and a deep affinity with land. They don't want to sell it. It's a family decision. You consult your chacha, your mamu before you're deciding. So what we do is we break up the family. हम उनका एक बंदा तोड़ लेते हैं और उससे कहते हैं हम तुम्हें 2% कमीशन देंगे, तुम उन्हें कन्विंस करो. So वही जो लोग बड़ा याद करते हैं कि पहले हमारे बड़े अच्छे ताल्लुकात होते थे, वो ऐसे ही नहीं ख़त्म हुए. They're very direct interventions that take place that result in this. But anyway, we have about 5 minutes before we move over to Q&A. So wanting to come to, okay, what can be done, right? How do we move forward? How do we think about an alternative? There's such politically, it's an entrenched interest at play, particularly when it comes to the issue of urban land. And what I also found fascinating was that a lot of people who are involved in land acquisition, who are involved in developing these schemes, a lot of times they say that this is a terrible thing we're doing. हमारी ज़राई ज़मीन ज़ाया हो रही है, ये किसी प्रोडक्टिव उसमें नहीं पैसा जा रहा है, लेकिन वो फिर भी ये कर रहे हैं. तो हम कैसे कोई अल्टरनेटिव सोच सकते हैं और वो क्या हो सकता है? मुश्किल सवाल है. I'm sure we won't have all the answers, but.
Do you want to go first? Do you want me to go first? Yes, please. Okay, that is a big question. There are two ways to approach it. I think one is more kind of incremental changes that one should pursue and should not dismiss just because it's incremental. And then the other one obviously has to be about, like everything in 2025, has to be about enlarging the way we imagine possibilities and moving away from market-centric sort of forms of governance, which I think anyway, because of the conditions of the world, we are moving away from sort of just a kind of vitriolic, vicious market. So that might open up opportunities to once again return to some form of coordinated state-led planning. I don't know, this is me talking hopefully, but also very futuristically, because I don't think it's gonna happen in the next 10 or 20 years. But in terms of more incremental kind of concrete things one could do, I think one thing is, it's the obvious answer, is to empower some form of local administrative authority. We don't have local governments that are very functional at all in Pakistan. I don't study local governments anymore, but the last that I was studying them, though, it was a complete kind of cartoon show in terms of mayors getting elected and being locked out of their offices because there was a changeover in government. And so I think you need to have some form of devolved government and administration that is responsive to the demands of people on the ground, rather than it being led from at a more central level, at the provincial level. I mean, हमारे तो मसला यही है ना कि Pakistani politics में rich people give money to the parties to help them get elected, and then those rich people become MPAs and MNAs, and then those people are given development funds, rather than local government elected representatives being empowered to respond to the needs of their communities. You have MPAs, provincial authorities, and national authorities who are given funds to develop their areas, which is very strange because obviously they're not going to be as responsive or cannot be as responsive to local concerns. And then the legal thing I can't ignore, but I think we really need to clarify the land acquisition and land purchasing regime in Pakistan. Pakistani cities, like I said, there's a very strange mishmash between using the DHA Bahriya model of purchasing land directly from landowners. एक ये model है, दूसरा model है land acquisition वाला जो मैंने आपको भी बताया था, eminent domain का. In my housing scheme, we're actually doing both, right? We're doing the DHA model of buying land directly from villagers, but then we're also using coercive legislation like the Land Acquisition Act. And that's really strange. I don't know, nobody knows where the rights and responsibilities that are provided under the Land Acquisition Act, when do they come into force? When you are otherwise using a Bahriya DHA model. So there's a huge lack of clarity about assignment of rights, duties, responsibilities under land acquisition and purchasing regimes in Pakistan, which I think is actually quite low-hanging fruit that we can do something about. And I feel like I've been saying this for 5 years, and now I should probably do something about it. But yeah, I think that's one channel, one area for effective reform.
Great, thank you, Aisha. Sadaf?
I think what I would add to that is there are local government. One stream is to empower local government, but also to fund local government. You can give them all the power, but if you don't fund them, things won't get done. So I think it's about tracking powers and funding. If they're still being funded from the center, then you can give them all the power in the world and nothing's going to still happen on the ground. I think the other thing is going back to the number of actors in the in that realm or in that domain. It is someone having or something, some actor having oversight over all. So if you've got 25 from the army to, in the case of Karachi, it's the Karachi Port Trust, railways, all of these, and housing societies as well, who has oversight over all, so that you are kind of bringing all of these actions together under one, kind of going back to what you were saying, right?
Actually, can I just quickly share a really funny anecdote? I asked the LDA who exercises oversight over the DHA, and why don't you? And they said, हम क्यों करें? वो तो हमसे बेहतर करते हैं. हमें उनसे सीखना चाहिए. So you're absolutely right. I think we need to have that happen on some level.
What's interesting is they say कि वो हमें पूरी तरह oversee करते हैं. हालांकि नहीं करते, लेकिन वो यही कहते हैं. But no, that's really helpful to hear also. And what's interesting is this is the third panel that I've attended today or been a part of, and every single panel ended with the conclusion that we need to empower local governments. So this is clearly something that has to be done, but there's also very little will, I think, to do it. So empowering local governments, transformations to law, and then also larger oversight, given how many institutions we have responsible for city development. So we have about 6-7 minutes for Q&A. I would just request to keep your questions short, and just let us know who you want to address the question.
Thank you. Dr. Aisha, it was absolutely alarming, shocking, and surprising facts that you brought. Thank you very much for pointing that out. I just wanted to ask, whenever urban planners talk about stuff and they condemn whatever is happening, how the green lands are being utilized for the societies, commercial societies, but nobody really talks about why people are ready, why people are pushed to sell their land to these societies. For instance, the urea, DAP, how difficult it has become to farm, and why the middleman is making a hell lot of money out of these things. And farmers, I am actually a son of a farmer, so I know the challenges my father and the people from my area are facing. And we had to sell our land in the Ruda because, I mean, we were forced to sell as middlemen you were talking about. But I think it would be great if urban planners like you talking about the issues where these farmers are actually forced to sell these lands. Thank you very much. Just wanted to point it out that nobody's really talking about these issues when they're talking about the urban planning. Thank you.
That's a really good question, and a structural issue that we can talk about. Any other questions? We'll just take 3 and then just respond collectively.
Thank you so much for all the facts and information. My name is Javeria. I work in development sector, not land social. My question is, as researchers and planners, you people are in that field, Pakistan doesn't seem to have any readiness regarding the recurring crises such as floods, leading to then food insecurity, leading to lack of agricultural land that is cultivatable. Are these aspects factored in? I'm also going to throw in the question about conflicts, because we have microculture conflicts as well in different parts of Pakistan. I know that you're largely talking about Lahore, but I'm curious to know if any of these things about crisis and conflicts are factored in, or if they are, what would then planning look like?
There's Shafak, question over there. Last question. I'll get mic.
Hello.
Classroom.
Thank you. So my question is more general, which goes back to what you were also saying, कि जो plot file होती है, that becomes a promise, right? And that's a very symbolic promise as well, because a lot of the zamindars who are currently protesting Ruda, उनका कहना ये है कि उनके जो landed, also landless laborers जो हैं, उनको plot file के through जो है convince किया जा रहा था कि आप लोग resist मत करें, right? And I think that is a very telling thing as well, which is that even though the dream of owning a house is becoming exclusionary, way more exclusionary than it ever was, the dream is still being kept alive. And I think if you could reflect on why that dream continues to attract such a huge audience, right? जो लोग वैसे नहीं include हो सकते, just having that property document, and that is something that I've also explored myself, कि उनके लिए वो एक document of sale deed हो या फिर कुछ भी हो, that bureaucratic document is a form of being legitimately included in a process that they will never benefit from. So how does that dream stay alive? If you could reflect on that a little bit.
Okay, thank you. Aisha, you want to begin?
Yeah, those are all three really big, really good questions. Aapka comment बहुत important tha, I think. You're absolutely right. And no, I'm not an urban planner, but thanks. I mean, you're right, an integrated approach is the only way to solve most things. One cannot look at housing in isolation from the broader political economy dynamics that are guiding people's decisions all the way from the top to the grassroots. So I completely agree with you. And again, I think आपका जो intervention था, वो बहुत important था, because जो हम dispossession वाली बात कर रहे थे, even if people end up selling their land and are happy to sell their land, again, one cannot ascribe the motive of like greed or cleverness or a sly attitude, which I think many scholars are beginning to do within urban studies, is to treat like, you know, the kind of wily ways of informal grassroots, you know, residents jo fayda uthate hain. But then actually, not to victimize them either, they are often doing these things because of the kind of things that you just mentioned. Because unki zindagi itni mushkil hai, wo aur kya kare. So I think aapka comment bahut zyada important tha. Thank you so much, and I'd love to talk to you afterwards about the kind of realities that you've seen in your area. Your question, did you say local conflicts? And I may have misunderstood. Yeah.
But so crisis
Yeah.
and conflict. And I asked that also because you work is in
Yeah.
Sudan as well, right? So I want to know how these things, because from what I see, they're not
Yeah.
considered in planning, whether that is in the urban or semi-urban areas.
Yeah. I mean, I think Sadaf will be able to answer that far better than I will, but just to give you an example of just how badly planned these things are, the war or floods, to bahut dur ki baat hai. There's a specific scheme, I won't name it, but it's an LDA scheme. Oh, I guess you can guess which one it is. Actually, no, you can't. There's 271 of them, 371. But there's a scheme where they began to develop it, and there was a lot of speculative investment pouring into the scheme. And then what happened was that the LDA had not even done basic surveying of the land. उन्होंने सिर्फ Google Maps से देखी थी ज़मीन को. उन्होंने कहा ठीक है यही है, ये यहाँ ही हम housing scheme बना लेंगे. Found out later that there were 2 other housing schemes there for a long time, including a very prestigious state-run one. So just to show you the utter lack of planning. So you know, I think Sadaf will do a better job at showing the kind of dimensions that you've specifically asked about. And the last question was about plot files and the dream of housing. That's a really good question. Actually, Shafaq, your name is Shafaq, right? Yeah, I would be really curious to speak to you also after the panel, because in my research site, people were not very willing, or were not finding the plot files to be very alluring compensatory measures for the exchange of their land. That is so interesting, and I think that would be, I think one could speak to maybe themes of proximity to the urban center, maybe talk about maybe the diversity of professions of the people who live there. I'm so curious to know why in your area they were so happy to do that and why in mine they weren't. I think that's fertile ground, pun intended, for research, collaborative research. I'd be really interested to hear that. So,
Yeah.
but dreams I cannot comment on.
Yeah, because I think even in what I've seen, previously there's been very little interest on the part of landowners to actually take files as well. But if that appears to be changing, that might also be greater acceptability of the fact that this holds some value in the market, and also the role that's played by middlemen in this process. But yeah, we should definitely talk. Sadaf, any last words? We are being asked to end. So
Very, very quickly, I think in terms of conflict, what often happens in cities is it may not be planned into a city, it will be people self-sorting. So if you feel unsafe, you will go and live with people who look and behave like you, as opposed to living in an environment that you feel unsafe. So that would be one thing that happens at a social level. At a planning level, what may happen is you end up with gated communities. So the securitization of the built environment. So fences, barricades, like little chabutras where people are sitting and they're monitoring who's coming in, who's going out. So I think this is what would happen at a planning level, but otherwise it's people self-sorting and living with people like them.
great. I just want to say a big thank you to our panelists once again. This is a long conversation. Thank you all so much for coming. You can continue outside. Thank you.